In this final chapter, Pincoffs continues in the same trajectory he's been going in previous chapters, bringing his case to a conclusion. We've already discussed his notion that there is such a thing as being the right sort, by which he means the right sort of person. As we delve into this chapter, we'll see more details of what he means by that and how we get there. Before getting into the details, however, I want to glance at that word becoming. If we are to become the right sort, there must be some sense in which we are undergoing a transition, a transformation from a state in which we are not yet the right sort. At its most basic, this requires a change to be possible. Our character is not something that's baked in from the beginning, not something determined and permanent. On the one hand, this can bring hope to the degree that I recognize myself to not be fully the right sort by my own conception of what that means. I can perhaps have hope that I can make progress and become the right sort. On the other hand, it might be that I can fail to become the right sort. I can decide that I prefer some other state. Perhaps this other state will be more narrowly delimited sense of being the right sort. Maybe I'll be content to be the right sort for me. Maybe my commitment to individualism will lead me to reject the possibility that there is any sense to the right sort other than as defined in narrow reference to myself. Can we imagine another possibility? If moral progress is possible, if I can transition from my current state toward becoming the right sort, can I also regress, move farther from being the right sort? The very first paragraph, Pincoffs lays out the picture he'll develop. He writes there on page 150, moral education is at once the most complex and the simplest, the most frustrating and the most rewarding, the most challenging and the easiest task of the teacher. It is complex because of the number of conceptions and misconceptions of its purpose, and because of the number of means to achieve the purpose that are in the field. It is simplest because there are straightforward and obvious things that the teacher can do to aid moral development. It is frustrating because the teacher is not, even in his own school, the only or necessarily the most important influence in the child's development of character. It is rewarding because nothing can seem more important than the revelation of admirable qualities in a child that are teacher inspired. It is challenging because the task is obviously centrally important and endlessly difficult. It is easy because the most effective procedure is to serve as a model of the sort of person the teacher would hope that the child should become. If you're looking at the script, you'll see that I bolded the key words Pincoffs uses to describe the process of moral formation here. For the one who would teach or form another to become the right sort, the task is complex, simple, frustrating, rewarding, challenging, and easy. How's that for an odd assortment of descriptions of a task? I'm only going to comment on two of these features and leave analysis of the others to you. First, Pincoffs says this task is simplest because there are straightforward and obvious things the teacher can do. Sure, there are many parts of the process that are difficult, many that may not even be yet able to conceive how to do. But as we seek to contribute to the moral formation of others, there are things we can do. Doing something is better than doing nothing. Second, and I think a great example of something we can do that is straightforward and obvious, is to take advantage of the task being easy. We can serve as a model of the sort of person we would hope the child should become. This requires naturally that we begin with our own moral formation before we begin with other people. When we are in a position to influence others toward moral formation, toward becoming the right sort of person, we start with a frank admission that we are ourselves in the process of becoming the right sort of person. We share with people our vision of what it looks like to be the right sort and demonstrate what steps we are taking to become that. If we don't begin with ourselves, our attempts to form or teach others can easily appear as the hypocritical, do as I say, not as I do. If we are open about our understanding of what we're aiming to become and how we're getting there, we impart that vision to those in our care, even as we demonstrate the means for achieving that end. If, in fact, our vision is winsome and attractive, it will draw people in. If, on the other hand, our vision is repulsive, that can provide us with input that might help us in our own moral development. On page 152, Pincoffs writes, qualities of character are just those dispositions, the possession of which can be our ground for preferring one person to another. My first thought here is, what does it mean to prefer one person to another? I can think of some possibilities. Perhaps we have in mind preferring one person over another to be a spouse, a friend, a returnee, a companion on a small boat for a 3-hour tour, a 3-hour tour. In many cases, we won't be relating to these people as whole people, just in terms of a few aspects of their personality and character. Most 3-hour boat tours I've been on haven't required me and my boatmates to be more than generally congenial. Now, if a storm were to arise and strand us on an island together for a few years, character would matter much more. At that point, I would surely prefer one sort of person over another. The simple, non-extended boat tour would be fine with most people, except for those who are obnoxious in some way. A person who was annoyingly intoxicated, who didn't know how to respect the space of others, who sought to rob me, would be a person I'd want to avoid. Some situations call for us to be more intimate with people. Consider friendship. We can establish friendships with just about anyone who is in our vicinity. Our limitations, however, will likely keep us from being friends with everyone in our vicinity. As we choose those who will be our friends, and not just friendly acquaintances, we might rightly prefer some character qualities over others. If we had Aristotle's 3 kinds of friendship in mind, I think we would do this with all 3 types. If we were looking for friends with whom we could be mutually beneficial, we would prefer reliability of character. If we were looking for friends to engage in pleasant activities, we'd prefer someone with an attractive and enjoyable personality to one who is grating or annoying. If we were seeking a friendship built on character and a common pursuit of the good, we'd clearly seek a friend who is already on the road to becoming the right sort of person, a person who would influence us in that direction also. Jumping ahead to page 170, we find this idea from the other side. Pincoffs writes there, for a trait to count as a virtue, there must be reason to think that the person who bears that trait is quite generally preferable to the person who does not. As we reflect on situations we encounter in living together, we recognize that some character qualities are not only useful, but even essential to the well-being of our community. We come to see that we need these qualities if we are to experience the good life together. In our work of morally educating others, we keep an eye to identifying these qualities and cultivating them in ourselves and in others. I see a couple of useful points on page 154. First is Pincoffs' identification of some character attributes that are destructive of human relations. Among these traits, he identifies selfishness, callousness, unfairness, and deceptiveness. I'm sure some of you have found yourself in relational proximity with people who display these traits. From what you've experienced of them, what do you think of these vices? To what degree do you see them as universally recognized as vices? Are there any contexts in which they are claimed as virtues? What would we have to believe about the nature of people and human relationships for any of these to count as virtues? We're investigating moral formation, becoming the right sort of person in this chapter. In this context, we're looking at the acquisition and impartation of virtues. But what about these vices? How do people learn these vices? How do people retain them? Do you think that the people who display these character traits recognize them and recognize that they have them? If so, do you think they value them? Did they think their having them is a good thing? Again, if they do, what kind of justification could be offered for each? In the middle of the page, Pincoffs writes, what is implicit in this account is a conception of the role of the teacher as a person who is better attuned to the demands of the world than is the child, and who cares enough for the child and for the world to help the child develop the appropriate dispositions. Becoming the right sort apparently entails a particular kind of relationship with the world. A solipsistic account that sees the world as at most a projection of the self is ruled out. There is, in at least some way, a world that is the way it is, regardless of our preferences. The teacher's knowledge of and familiarity with this world, whether gained from experience or formal study, is of value to the teacher and to the student through the teacher's instruction. Some of us old timers look back on our childhood that featured things like riding down the highway together in the back of a pickup truck. We jokingly talk about that being in the days before Newton's laws of motion were enacted. You know, that whole an object in motion tends to stay in motion bit. Now, with those laws in place, we know that riding that way, or even neglecting wearing a seatbelt, can lead to disastrous consequences if the vehicle were to come to a sudden stop. We know something of how the world works and how that working can hurt people if we don't take account of its working. One way to look at this aspect of moral formation is to consider the role of metaphysics in ethical thinking. If ethics is the inquiry into the nature of the good life and how to achieve it, then metaphysics attends to the nature of the reality in which we live and pursue the good life. In at least some cases, the more we know about the world and how it operates, the better we'll be able to navigate our way toward the good life. On page 155, Pincoffs considers how bringing the child to appreciate as fully as possible that certain qualities are virtues and that others are vices is a sign of care for the child. A few chapters back, we saw Pincoffs' long catalog of virtues. You might go back and look at that sometime. Most likely, parents and other teachers of children never explicitly go through such a catalog. There are two significant contexts in which we encounter virtues and vices implicitly. One is in daily life. When we're experiencing a virtue, say timeliness, we might not in the moment have the thought, I am now experiencing timeliness in myself or in another. I am now seeing the good of this virtue. Sometimes we will come to see this virtue as a virtue when we experience its deficiency. When we have a limited amount of time, perhaps having events scheduled back to back, and have to rely on other people to be on time, and they're not on time, we see the value of being on time, the value of timeliness. There are also situations where we experience negative consequences of our own lack of timeliness and think something like, if only I had been on time. Our internal processing of these events can help us see these dispositions as virtues or vices. We might also have occasions for external processing of these events, say over a meal later with family or friends. As we talk through our experiences of the day, and our shared reflection on those experiences could produce clearer understanding of what's been happening, the virtues and vices we've encountered or expressed. The second place where identification of character qualities might happen is in stories. Tying in with the first place, these stories might be the reports of experiences we share with others through the normal course of life. Other times can be through hearing or reading of stories in the news or in fiction. Stories do not have to be reports of actual events for us to see character qualities and dispositions in play. We can take note of virtuous and vicious characteristics even in the most unrealistic place, maybe science fiction or fantasy, for example. We can even find it in literature where the characters are personified animals, say Watership Down. As we read or watch these stories, we can think, I'd like to be this character if I'm ever in a situation like that. Or conversely, we might say, if I were ever in that situation, I would never want to act like that person. we wanted to take our learning farther, we could imagine what led the character to do whatever action we are commenting on, what made the person into that sort of person. In that same paragraph on page 155, Pincoffs writes, to become the right sort of person is to become the sort of person that the community needs, must have, if it is to continue as a desirable association. Sometimes the kind of person a community needs is widely evident. I think of Ukraine here in the spring of 2022. What kind of leader does that country need now as it's being invaded by a much larger country? One might think they need someone who has spent a lifetime in politics, having learned from multiple crises and dealing with multiple constituencies. But how about an actor, a comedian even? If we were to just consider the resume that President Zelensky brought to the job, we might not have very high expectations. From what I've seen so far, he has been formed to become the kind of leader his community needs now. Very few of us will be called upon to offer top leadership in the midst of an existential national crisis. Instead, we find ourselves part of smaller communities, families, neighborhoods, workplaces, and associations. These communities have needs. We can give thought to the needs of these communities and how we can become the sort of people who will help them achieve their missions, and in a healthy way. Pincoffs closes the chapter and the book with 9 suggestions for teachers who seek to inculcate virtue in their students. I encourage you to consider these suggestions. Which have you seen exemplified in the lives of people who have contributed to your moral formation? When you saw these practices exemplified, did you appreciate them at the time? Now, at further remove, have you come to reevaluate any of your early assessments? Which of these do you think is most needed in the setting you inhabit? My own inclination is toward the last suggestion, where he says, teachers must try to forget the nonsense that they may have learned about not being judgmental. They must instead do what they can to develop a sense for when moral judgment is and is not appropriate, and for what the ethological parameters of moral judgment are. The focus of our current education industrial complex on testing sometimes leads us to focus on learning that can be clearly and objectively assessed and quantified. Learning facts and details is important, even essential in most disciplines. Even more important in most of our disciplines is skilled judgment. Looking beyond my own disciplines, I think of other disciplines I rely on and the judgment necessary for these disciplines to do what I need. I think of plumbers, carpenters, electricians, people in various medical fields, engineers, farmers. Each of these disciplines requires practitioners to make constant, careful judgments. Of course, there is a problem with judgmentalism that we can't ignore. My own religious tradition has a dictum from its founder that declares, "Don't judge lest you yourself be judged." We have a strong tradition of judging the act of judging. Even there, however, we see the seed of the truth that judgment is inevitable. We cannot avoid it. We can shirk our duty to judge when it may be uncomfortable, make us unpopular, or cost us something. Shirking the duty to judge, more particularly to judge accurately and well, carries a cost to us and our communities. At the same time that I would lift up good judgment as a necessary virtue, I would also want to agree with a negative judgment directed at judgmentalism, especially when that disposition is directed at people in a way that condemns them and tears them down. If I'm doing something wrong or going the wrong way, it's useful to me to have someone show me the error of my ways. It's not useful for them to dig into my life with accusation and condemnation, seeking to destroy me. It can be a difficult job to pass the virtue of wise discernment, a more positive word for the kind of judging I'm advocating. It is much easier to spot the enemy and attack. What about you? Do you see the distinction I'm making between helpful judgment and destructive judgment? Do you have experience with either? If you have you learned to deploy wise discernment in your own life? What are some of the things that have helped develop that virtue in you?